Scion of one of the oldest of the hereditary nobilities of Prussia, Hasso Eckhard von Manteuffel, was, at 47, young for an army command, and at 5 feet 2 inches and 120 pounds, hardly of the physique to inspire awe in subordinates. When he was a cadet officer candidate at the age of 14 at the Berlin Lichterfelder Academy, they had to remove a portion of his rifle barrel to enable him to manipulate it in drill. At last, old enough for military service in 1916, he served on the Western Front as a lieutenant of infantry, where he was wounded slightly by shrapnel. Long an avid and expert horseman, von Manteuffel transferred after the war to the cavalry and became enthused over the possibilities of armour as espoused by a young major, Heinz Guderian. He joined the Inspectorate General of Armoured Forces soon after Guderian in 1934 became its Chief of Staff. Then, as later, von Manteuffel was apolitical, in the true Prussian tradition. Although von Manteuffel saw Hitler's attack on Russia as a mistake, he volunteered for frontline service, commanded a Panzergrenadier battalion, and soon replaced the fallen commander of his regiment. During the unsuccessful drive on Moscow, he performed with such distinction that he gained promotion to colonel and received the Knight's Cross to the Iron Cross. As the German retreat began in heavy snows and below zero cold, von Manteuffel ran afoul of his army commander, Colonel General Walter Model. Model ordered von Manteuffel to make an attack, but hardly had it begun before von Manteuffel called it off. The snow was so deep his men could barely move. Outraged, Model went to von Manteuffel's headquarters and threatened court-martial, but the division commander diffused the issue by sending von Manteuffel with the advance party for the division's impending transfer to France. By the time von Manteuffel saw Model again, the diminutive soldier his friends called him Kleiner had commanded a division in North Africa and had returned to the Eastern Front to lead an elite panzer division, Grossdeutschland. He so impressed Adolf Hitler in the process that the Führer summoned him to the Wolfschanze to jump him past Corps Command to the rank of General der Panzertruppen and command of the 5th Panzer Army on the Western Front. In October 1944, as the 5th Panzer Army shifted to the command of Army Group B, von Manteuffel, with some trepidation reported to Field Marshal Model's headquarters near Krefeld. Entering Model's office, he saluted and noted with relief that Model returned the salute. "You remember our conversation in 1941? Asked Model. "Now we two have the same task, we are good friends." More than anybody other than Hitler himself, von Manteuffel put his imprint on the way the big offensive was to begin. As part of the unsuccessful effort to talk Hitler out of the big solution, he found an opportunity when he saw Hitler at the Reichschancellery on December 2nd, to convince the Führer to make changes. Rather than a 2 to 3 hour artillery preparation, he argued that a short, concentrated preparation would accomplish much the same effect while lessening the enemy's alert. Rather than attack at 10 a.m., which would leave little more than 6 hours of daylight for the first day's operation, he wanted the artillery preparation to begin well before daylight at 5:30 a.m., followed a half-hour later by a ground assault assisted by artificial moonlight to be created by bouncing the light of giant searchlights off the clouds. "How do you know you will have clouds?" asked Hitler. Responded von Manteuffel, "You have already decided there will be bad weather." Having donned the uniform of a colonel of infantry and spent a night in a pillbox overlooking the Our River, von Manteuffel had personally determined that outposts of the American 28th Division's 110th Infantry pulled back from the river at night. He thus proposed no artillery fire along the river, so that the assault troops could begin crossing while the artillery was hitting American positions a mile or so beyond on the Skyline Drive. Since he also discerned that the positions of the 28th Division's 112th Infantry, which were on the German side of the Our, were widely spaced, he asked authority to forego an artillery preparation there, so that troops might infiltrate between and in rear of the American positions before the hour of attack. To all those proposals, Hitler agreed. Split seconds before 5:30 a.m. on Saturday, December 16, an American soldier from Company K, 110th Infantry, manning an observation post atop a concrete water tower along the Skyline Drive in the village of Hosingen, telephoned his company commander. In the distance on the German side of the Our, he could see a strange phenomenon, countless flickering pinpoints of light. Moments later, both he and his company commander had the explanation. They were the flashes of German guns, for at Hosingen, along the rest of the Skyline Drive, and at many another point along what had been the quiet front in the Ardennes, the morning darkness suddenly came alive with a maelstrom of bursting shells. No experienced mechanized cavalry commander, least of all a stickler for spit and polish and soldiering by the rules such as Colmark A. Devine Jr., would have viewed the positions of the 18th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron with anything less than dismay. Devine and headquarters of the 14th Cavalry Group had assumed responsibility for the cavalry squadron on December 11. To defend the Losheim Gap, the roughly 800 men had had to sacrifice the one genuine asset of lightly armed mechanized cavalry, mobility. They instead occupied little fixed islands of defense, mainly in widely separated farm villages, most of them built in depression's sugar bowls. The troops called them, providing some relief from the raw winds that swept the heights, but affording little advantage for military defense. To compound Devine's problems, one of his 3 troops had been detached to strengthen defences at the other end of the Schnee Eifel. On the other hand, Devine had the assistance of 12 towed 3-inch guns and 2 reconnaissance platoons of the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion, as well as the self-propelled 105 mm howitzers of the 275th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, attached to the 106th Division, but detailed to support of the 14th Cavalry Group. In large measure, the positions occupied by the cavalrymen reflected those prepared originally by units of the 2D Division, which upon first arriving in October had had no cavalry attachment. Thus, the stronger positions, if any could be called strong, were in the south close to the Schnee Eifel, blocking roads leading from the Losheim Gap into the rear of the Schnee Eifel, for holding those roads was critical to maintaining the positions on the high ridge. All the roads led by one route or another to the upper valley of the Auer River, and thence down the valley to the village of Schönberg, where a road coming around the south end of the Schnee Eifel joined up. From Schönberg, St.Vith is only 6 miles to the west. Unknown to the cavalrymen, the boundary between the 6th Panzer Army to the north and the 5th Panzer Army ran through the southern portion of the Losheim Gap. That was designed to provide running room for Kampfgruppe Piper and the rest of the 1st SS Panzer Division in the bid for a swift drive to the Meuse, while at the same time affording General von Manteuffel just enough space for swinging a pincer around the north end of the Schnee Eifel. The southernmost unit of the 6th Panzer Army, the 3D Parachute Division, intent on opening up routes for the tanks, thus hit, for the most part, the north portion of the 14th Cavalry Group's positions, where the little islands of defence consisted of only 2 to 4 towed tank destroyers and a few riflemen and machine gunners from one of the reconnaissance platoons of the attached tank destroyer company. Most of the other cavalry positions were in the path of 2 regiments of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, supported by the bulk of the division's artillery and reinforced by a battalion of 4075 mm. Assault guns, and as many self-propelled tank destroyers equipped with long-barreled 75s. The Volksgrenadiers were seeking access to the valley of the Auer and the road to Schönberg, there to link with their division's 3rd Regiment coming around the other end of the Schnee Eifel. Just before 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, men on outpost duty in the villages in the Losheim Gap saw the same kind of spectacular flickers of light on the horizon as had the soldier on the water tower atop the Skyline Drive. Moments later followed a bombardment from artillery, rockets, and mortars such as no one in the 18th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had experienced before. Amid the thunder, the troops could make out the distinctive screeching sound of rockets screaming mimes from the Nebelwerfer, a multiple-barreled, electrically fired rocket launcher. Yet little of the shelling hit the villages in the southernmost reaches of the Losheim Gap, the villages of Weckerath, Roth, and Kobscheid. That reflected the fact that German patrols had found an undefended area of more than a mile between Weckerath and Roth, and at the last minute, General von Manteuffel decided to eschew an artillery preparation there, while sending a column through the gap to gain a leg on the march to the valley of the Auer battalion of Volksgrenadiers, was soon pushing unhindered in the darkness toward the village of Au, whence the road continued to the Auer. There was also another road from AUW leading south atop the 1st ridgeline behind the Schnee Eifel, a road which troops of the 2D Division had named Skyline Boulevard. Hardly had the artillery fire lifted elsewhere and passed on to targets farther to the American rear than German searchlights flicked on, providing a kind of eerie moonlight made the more effective by reflection off the snow. It was a new and in some ways disturbing experience for the men in the Losheim Gap, but they soon realized that the illumination helped them at least as much as it did the attackers. At Köbscheid, as at all the cavalry posts, the defences had been heavily reinforced with .50 caliber machine guns taken from the squadron's armoured cars. Those and other weapons manned by 2 platoons of cavalry opened fire just as the Germans reached barbed wire encircling the village. Throughout the day, the fight at Köbscheid eddied back and forth, but for the most part, the cavalrymen held their own. Not so at Roth, which sat astride the most direct route to the Aue. The Germans needed Roth to move reinforcements and supporting guns for the foot column that had already bypassed the village, so that from the start, the Volksgrenadiers attacking Roth had strong support from assault guns. Consisting of a lone platoon of cavalry, the few men of Troop A headquarters under Captain Stanley E. Porsche, and 2 of the virtually immobile towed 3-inch tank destroyers, the defenders of Roth were hard-pressed from the start. Although Colonel Devine tried to send a platoon of light tanks to help, the tankers found the road blocked by those Volksgrenadiers who had slipped past Roth. By late morning, hope for Captain Porsche and his men was fading. At Weckerath, only a few men from headquarters of Troop C were in the village, but a troop of light tanks quickly arrived to help. From the village, the crews of the light tanks could see what looked to be about 15 tanks. They were either assault guns or tank destroyers, accompanied by a battalion of infantry marching through the gap between Weckerath and Roth. Although the tanks opened fire, as did 75 assault guns on a ridgeline farther back, the Germans plodded on. The pincer around the northern end of the Schnee Eifel was moving methodically into place, and there was little the cavalrymen could do about it. At Kruinkel, the next village to the north, where a platoon of cavalry and a platoon of attached reconnaissance troops had been jolted by the opening artillery barrage. The men watched incredulously through the eerie half-light created by the searchlights as a column of men from the 3D parachute division marched down the road, talking, whistling, singing as if they were on a hike. The commander of the little garrison, First Lieutenant Kenneth Ferrens, waited until the Germans were almost atop the outer coils of wire before he gave his men the signal to fire. The first fusillade wreaked terrible damage on the German column, but those men who survived quickly dispersed and pressed the attack. About 50 got inside the village, where fighting raged at close quarters, but the Americans, firing from dug-in positions and from a sturdy stone church and schoolhouse, had the advantage. "Surrender, Americans!" yelled some of the Germans. "You are surrounded!" Full light of day was still to come when the Germans began to withdraw. One man among the last to leave shouted toward Lieutenant Ferrens' command post, "Take a 10-minute break, soldier. We will be back." To which Ferrens responded, "And we will be waiting for you, you son of a bitch." In the meantime, Troop C executive officer, First Lieutenant Aubrey L. Mills, had made it through a hail of small arms fire into Kruinkel with a half-track loaded with ammunition. As Lieutenant Ferrens had promised, the defenders were thus ready and waiting when German paratroopers wearing white camouflage suits made a second assault. Some got into the lower eastern fringe of the village, but that was all. At least 150 Germans died in the 2 assaults. Miraculously, only 2 Americans were wounded and 1 killed, Lieutenant Mills. Having continued past Kruinkel a few hundred yards to the next village of Afst, Mills had just started back when he took a bullet between the eyes. At Afst, which was the only other village occupied by the cavalrymen, the glow from the enemy's searchlights also provided a first view of attacking Germans for Lieutenant Crawford and the men of his platoon. Like Ferrens, Crawford waited until the white-suited Germans were close to the outer wire before signalling his men to fire. Not one German got inside the wire before the leaders whistled withdrawal, leaving behind 30 dead. At the drab settlement of Lanzerath, near the northern extremity of the Losheim Gap on the forward slope of a high ridgeline, Suzanne Schur lived with her parents in a house on the eastern edge of the village, overlooking a wide valley toward the pillboxes of the west wall and the German village of Losheim. when 12 American soldiers came to stay in the Schur household, digging an emplacement for a machine gun in the garden. Sanny slept at night between her mother and father, concerned that the soldiers might molest her. An attractive young woman of 25, she found it baffling that nobody ever made a pass at her. The soldiers were always polite and would never let her carry heavy loads. She warmed their rations for them, and they gave some to her and her parents. Sanny particularly liked the K-ration cheese, which had little slivers of bacon in it. When the German shelling began before daylight on December 16th, Sanny and her parents retreated to the cellar. Most of the Americans joined them. Then, as the shelling continued, the men who had been manning the machine gun in the garden also came to the cellar. The shelling had stopped, and some time had passed when the door at the top of the cellar stairs opened and another American appeared. He said something to the other soldiers, and they hurried upstairs. When Sanny went to get her father a cup of coffee, she found all the soldiers gone. They had obviously left in a hurry, for they had abandoned much of their equipment, including their radio. Sanny had just returned to the cellar when she heard heavy footsteps overhead. Mounting the stairs, she opened the door warily to find an irate SS trooper. Why had she allowed the Americans to fire a machine gun from her garden? Noticing the American radio, he grabbed it and smashed it against the wall. When he stormed out of the house without searching it, Sanny hastily gathered all the American equipment and hid it under the potatoes in the cellar. In the process, she came upon a note addressed to her by one of the soldiers. "This is just a present for being so nice to us during our stay here. I am sorry we couldn't have stayed longer. I will remember your kindness and good luck to you, also to your mother and father. Signed by Russell. P.S. If I ever come back through here, I will stop to see you." Sanny Schur had witnessed the departure of part of Lanzerath's tiny garrison, a squad of reconnaissance troops, and the crews of 2 3-inch guns of the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Others who witnessed the swift withdrawal were men of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 99th Division's 394th Infantry, who just a few days earlier had occupied log-covered foxholes in a copse of fir trees atop a hill just north of Lanzerath, only a few hundred yards up the slope from the Schur's house. "If they cannot sign off on the phone," said PFC William J. Tsakanicus to his platoon leader, First Lieutenant Lyle J. Book, Jr., as the half-tracks towing the guns disappeared, "they might at least wave goodbye as they leave." To Tsakanicus and Book, the departure from Lanzerath looked like a bug-out, yet even if it was, Book at least was inclined to afford the crews some compassion, for so vulnerable were towed anti-tank guns that their first shot was often their last. It was indeed a bug-out, but at 9:30 a.m. the cavalry commander, Colonel Devine, made it legal by ordering all the towed 3-inch guns to be pulled back to the vicinity of his headquarters in Manderfeld, for at 2 other villages near Lanzerath, the crews of 6 of the towed tank destroyers were under siege from overwhelming numbers of paratroopers. Although most of the men got away, they managed to save only 2 of the guns. The crisis in the Losheim Gap was all the more alarming for Mark Devine, because he was frustratingly aware that he had been able to achieve no defensive coordination with the 106th Division. When he first arrived on December 11th to assume responsibility for the sector, he had learned from the commander of the 18th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, Lieutenant Colonel William F. Damon, Jr., that the 2D Division had prepared a plan, in case the Germans came around the north end of the Schnee Eifel through the Losheim Gap to counterattack with a reserve infantry battalion supported by attached tanks. Although Devine had gone promptly to the 106th Division's command post in St.Vith to try to affirm the continued existence of that plan, the division commander, Major General Alan W. Jones, and his staff were too preoccupied with the myriad details of getting their division into the line to be bothered with a counterattack plan. It was, after all, a quiet sector, and nothing was likely to happen. Once the problems of relieving the 2D Division had been dealt with, there would be time enough to coordinate with the attached cavalry. Thus frustrated, Devine put his staff to work on a plan of his own to be executed should something happen before he could coordinate with the 106th Division. He decided on a fighting withdrawal from the original positions in the villages to a ridgeline marked by his headquarters village of Manderfeld, and from there, if required, to a second ridgeline 2 miles behind Manderfeld. He intended bringing forward the 32D Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, which had only recently arrived and was then well to the rear in the town of Vielsalm, repairing its light tanks and other vehicles. As the 32D cavalry counterattacked, he would pull the 18th Cavalry back. The commander of the 32D Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Ridge, and his staff reconnoitred possible routes for the proposed counterattack, while Devine's staff worked to get the plan ready for distribution on the morning of December 16th. Because the opening artillery barrage knocked out all wire communications to the forward posts and German jamming made radio communications difficult, Devine at first had little information about what was happening, and he was not one to go forward under fire to find out for himself. He nevertheless assumed the peril sufficient to order Colonel Ridge to bring his 32D cavalry forward. After ordering the tank destroyers in northern reaches of the Losheim Gap to fall back, Devine alerted the cavalrymen in the villages in front of Manderfeld to be ready to withdraw at 11 a.m., by which time he hoped the 32D cavalry would have arrived. The response from Kobscheid and Roth was less than encouraging. From Kobscheid came word that it would be impossible to withdraw during daylight, but the troops probably could hold and escape after dark. From Captain Porsche in Roth, there was even less hope. A last radio message soon emerged. Enemy self-propelled guns were 75 yards from CP, firing direct fire. Out. Of a garrison of 90 men at Roth, 3 were killed and 87 surrendered. When Colonel Devine asked General Jones by telephone for help, Jones replied that he could provide nothing at this time. In which case, said Devine, he had no choice but to fall back to the Manderfeld Ridge, whereupon he hoped to counterattack with the 32D Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. The fact that Devine might be able to counterattack eased concern for the Losheim Gap at headquarters of the 106th Division. At any rate, in St.Vith, they had troubles enough of their own. When the withdrawal from Weckerath-Kruwinkel and Afst began, so close was the enemy that it was a shootout in the tradition of stagecoaches beset by Indians in the Wild West. The cavalrymen clambered aboard any vehicle that could move: jeeps, half-tracks, armoured cars, light tanks, holding on with one hand so they could shoot with the other. Because of the cold and lack of any opportunity to warm transmissions and engines in advance, the vehicles could make only about 10 miles an hour. At that agonizingly slow pace, they had to run a gauntlet of Germans on both sides of the road. 2 light tanks led the way, machine guns blazing, while men clinging to the lurching vehicles fired their individual weapons. Although most of the Germans took cover, they fired repeatedly, while some stood erect waving their arms and shouting for the Americans to surrender. The last man to leave Afst, Lieutenant Crawford, fired a bazooka to prevent a self-propelled gun from charging the rear of the column. Despite the German fire, not a man was killed, and only 1 wounded. At Kobscheid, the 2 platoons held throughout the afternoon. Soon after nightfall, the remaining 61 men sabotaged their vehicles, broke into 3 groups, and slipped out of the village to a rendezvous point in a woodlot a few hundred yards away. Over the next 3 days, bumping into and shying away from German columns and shaking German patrols that followed their tracks in the snow, they made their way to St.Vith. As the main body of the cavalry began to dig in on the Manderfeld Ridge, it was obvious from patrol reports that the Germans were pushing around both flanks. To cover the southern flank, Devine sent a troop of the 32D cavalry to Andler, a village affording entry to the valley of the Auer, to seal the northern flank and re-establish contact with the 99th Division. He sent another troop of the 32D cavalry with the assault guns of the 18th Cavalry, formed as a task force under Major James L. Mays, driving up the road along the crest of the Manderfeld Ridge toward Lanzerath. The task force reached a road junction half the distance to Lanzerath, but there ran into a battalion of the 3D Parachute Division, supported by self-propelled guns and some of the towed 3-inch guns captured earlier from the Americans. There was no getting past them. With the Germans moving unchecked around the north flank, Devine saw no hope of holding the Manderfeld Ridge. Around 4 p.m., he asked the 106th Division for permission to withdraw to the next ridgeline 2 miles behind Manderfeld, while continuing to anchor his south flank at Andler, which would still deny the Germans access to the road down the valley of the Auer, in rear of the Schnee Eifel. General Jones approved. To Devine, it seemed inexplicable that the Germans made no effort to interfere with the withdrawal. The reality was that except at Andler, the 14th Cavalry Group had ceased for the moment to be of concern either to the 18th Volksgrenadier Division or to the 3D Parachute Division. The Volksgrenadiers had yet to reach Andler, and when they got there, they were to turn away from the cavalrymen to push down the valley road to Schönberg. Meanwhile, the paratroopers, however belatedly, were busy accomplishing their mission of opening routes for the 1st SS Panzer Division. That night, as the cavalrymen dug in on their new position without contact with the enemy, their commander, Colonel Devine, went to St.Vith to talk with General Jones and try to get help. Jones said he was too busy at present to speak with him, but told him to stick around the command post until he found the time. Devine was still waiting when daylight came. That he stayed without raising any kind of a fuss was out of character, for to at least one who knew Devine well, he seemed like a volcano about to erupt, and to wait all night in St.Vith displayed an odd complacency for a colonel with long years of service who had to be aware that his command was in serious peril. Operating essentially with a single cavalry reconnaissance squadron, the 14th Cavalry Group had done about all that could have been expected from such a light force. The cavalrymen had sounded the alarm and delayed the enemy, which were the roles of cavalry on defence. They had done their job, moreover, with minimal casualties, and in a sector where the attacker outnumbered the defender far more heavily than anywhere else on the first day of the offensive. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, the failure to hold the original positions posed a critical peril for the 106th Division. The most immediate peril came from the battalion of Volksgrenadiers that had infiltrated the gap between Weckerath and Roth and headed for AUW, where only a company of the 81st Engineer Combat Battalion, the 106th Division's Organic Engineers, barred the way. Since the village was at the end of the enemy's infiltration route, it drew a heavy bombardment in the German artillery preparation. Tumbling from sleeping bags, the engineers hurried to the cellars, there to find the local inhabitants the village was inside Germany, already dressed and taking cover, which prompted some of the men to recall having seen a young woman the night before going from house to house. When the shelling ended, and nothing else happened, the company commander, Capt. Harold M. Harmon, turned out his roadwork details as usual, but only one platoon had departed beyond recall when in mid-morning German small arms fire erupted. Some of the engineers dashed for previously prepared defensive positions, others for the houses. They were making a good fight of it until German assault guns appeared and began a brutal and systematic fire. Just before German grenadiers closed in, one American platoon and men of the company headquarters made a run for it, some in jeeps, some on foot, heading for the next village of Andler. For the remaining platoon, the escape route led across an open field, so there was little hope of getting out unless somebody somehow could distract the enemy's attention. Peepel, Edward S. Withy, made that job his. "I will stay," he said. "Get going." Armed with a Thompson submachine gun, Withy began a steady fire while the rest of the men raced across the open ground to safety. When all had escaped, Withy somehow managed to surrender. Although the Germans had yet to gain Andler and access to the Valley of the Our, they already possessed at Kobscheid and AUW entree to two roads leading in behind the Schnee Eifel. From Kobscheid, a farm track led to the village of Schlausenbach and headquarters of one of the 106th Division's regiments, and from AUW a road ran along the top of the ridgeline immediately behind the Schnee Eifel Skyline Boulevard. There was obviously nothing the 14th Cavalry Group could do at that point to help the 106th Division block its north flank, except to try to hold at Andler. That Troop B, 32D Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, was preparing to do, but on the ridgeline extending to the northwest, which constituted the 14th Cavalry Group's third delaying position, there was less resolve. Lacking direction from Colonel Devine, who was still in St.Vith, some commanders were looking for excuses to continue to retire. One of those was the commander of the 32D Cavalry's Troop A, First Lieutenant Robert B. Repper, who was concerned that his little force stood all alone on the north end of the new defensive line and that he had no contact with anybody. Although he asked for authority to move north to join the troops of the 99th Division in the village of Honsfeld, he had yet to receive it when he decided to act on his own. He and his men reached Honsfeld shortly after 9 p.m., there to find a captain from the 99th Division organising a defence of the village with men from a regimental rest centre and anybody else who happened into the village. Reppe might have done better to have stayed where he was. To break past the Schnee Eifel and take the road centre of St.Vith, General von Manteuffel had 2 Volksgrenadier divisions under the 66th Corps. To ensure close coordination for the pincers carrying out the dual envelopment of the Schnee Eifel, he insisted that the Corps commander, General der Artillerie Walter Lucht, make 1 division responsible for both prongs. General Lucht chose to give the assignment to the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, primarily because that division had been holding the line there since late October, and thus had some familiarity with the terrain. He also directed the 62D Volksgrenadier Division, newly rebuilt from remnants of a division destroyed on the Eastern Front, to attack alongside the 18th Volksgrenadier Division's southern flank, take a bridge over the Our River at the customs post of Steinebruck, 5 miles southeast of St.Vith, and support the 18th Volksgrenadier Division's drive on St.Vith, except for the assault guns and tank destroyers that were mostly with the pincer moving around the north end of the Schnee Eifel, and a battalion of assault guns with the 62D Volksgrenadier Division. Neither division had any armour. All the 5th Panzer Army's tanks were either farther south making the main effort against the Skyline Drive, or in reserve with restrictions on their use imposed by Field Marshal Model. Because von Manteuffel needed the roads funneling through St.Vith to broaden the base of his drive to the west, he nevertheless insisted that the town be taken on the first day of the offensive. When a military force first attacks, then stops the attack and shifts to the defensive, the positions it assumes usually reflect the positions reached as the attack came to an end.